most of the conversations to me felt like they were kind of happening in a vacuum without a lot of connection with the real world. Fast forward to 2023, I kind of feel that that's still true. But there's this beauty of sort of like this naive optimism and experimentation that would never change, because that's how crazy new things are born.
Hi everyone, it's Jordan from the NEWFORUM team, and on today's episode, NEWFORUM is honored to have Gregory Landua, co-founder of Regen Network, host of Planetary Regeneration, and human coordinator, to cover the different forms of capital in Web3, the Regen Network's vision, as well as Gregory's main takeaways for a more regenerative future. So Gregory, welcome to the episode, and let's start if you're ready.
Thanks, Jordan. Yeah, I'm excited to jump in.
Perfect. So how did your journey in Web3 start?
Boy, that's a good question. So I had been tracking Bitcoin since the white paper was released, because I was a currency geek before. So I was really into local exchange trading systems and sort of Bernard Lietaer's complementary currency vision. And when the Bitcoin white paper came out, different people in those communities were sort of chatting about it. So I was kind of aware that things were happening and, interested. And then at that point, I mean, I didn't like fire up my laptop and mine or anything. I was just sort of aware and interested. And then in about 2015, so a long gap of me continuing my work of at that time, permaculture, design and consulting, and regenerative business work, sort of supporting people to build regenerative business.
Right. Sorry to interrupt you there, Gregory. It's true. I should have started with this. So at the time of the white paper of Bitcoin, you were already consulting on regenerative practices back then. Can you just briefly touch on that part? Sorry about that.
Yeah, I'm doing regenerative economics work and regenerative finance work. So at that point, my livelihood was doing permaculture, design consulting, and education with a special focus on business design. And so I was really focused on this question of what does it look like for people to operate, usually small businesses at that time, that, made the soil healthier, increased biodiversity, sort of met human needs while increasing ecological health. And that both has to combine ecological practices and agricultural practices, but also you have to build a business, you have to build a livelihood, you have to have inflows of money, and
the hardest part, obviously,
you need this sort of like whole cycle. And we already at that point, I was just realizing how fundamental money is, and how just sort of asking this question, what if we were able to program or evolve money to be reflective of different societal values or different ecological values? So that was already a really interesting sort of line of research and kind of core to different choices that I was making. And then Bitcoin came along, so I was sort of aware that there was this, this thing happening using cryptography and computer science to make money make a different type of money. But I looked at it more as like as a monetary experiment, I guess you could say.
Right, especially when the white paper came out. So was there a shift between like 2010, 11 and actually 2015, as you mentioned, where it started with like kind of the currency experiment, and then you started seeing the applications in Ethereum? Did that start changing your perspective when it comes to your background, and you thought, wait a second, I can do more than just look at it from this perspective? There's much more to do.
For sure. It was very interesting. Although, so in 2015, I bought some Ethereum, I bought some Bitcoin, but I would have to say I was skeptical of both Bitcoin and Ethereum for different reasons. So I wasn't, at that time, I was like, I think the DAO hack had happened, and
we had Rip Green on, and to explain that, that was
and I had some friends who were pretty deep into the Ethereum world, and I was still kind of skeptical
you didn't fully believe necessarily in the thesis. What made you kind of, without going too much into it, but what made you kind of skeptical about Bitcoin and Ethereum for different reasons? And also we'll touch on that later in the episode, but has that perspective changed in 2023? But first, like, what made you skeptical back then?
I mean, different reasons. I mean, on the Bitcoin side of things, I've always felt that there's a bunch of reasons why I don't buy into like this idea.
Full maximalist of replacing the dollar at that time, like it's interesting, but you didn't fully buy.
Totally, and like having a digital version of that, I'm like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
But I was more like, I bet a lot of people will think this is a good idea.
Oh, I think a lot of people will think this is a good idea. Was it really a good idea, depending on the time? Because it's like a few years to really ramp up, you could argue. Okay, so we got
at that time, it had already kind of done a little, like some stuff, and I don't know. I was just I was just speculating.
And so Ethereum comes along, and did that kind of change your perspective, or same thing? You were like, okay, I was skeptical
of Ethereum for different reasons. I was excited about it, but I was also skeptical because it felt like people were trying to sort of naively create these automated, smart contract systems without generally a lot of awareness about the real world. That was my skepticism, is like, and I was hanging out with some people who were in the community and other things. And what is exciting about it was like, oh, there's this community that is like thinking about this evolution and transformation of money and law. And that I'm stoked about it. That's great. That's awesome. But most of the conversations to me felt like they were kind of happening in a vacuum without a lot of connection with the real world. Fast forward to 2023, I kind of feel that that's still true. But there's this beauty of sort of like this naive optimism and experimentation that would never change, because that's how crazy new things are born. And just like be a curmudgeon all the time and have the world evolve.
And you could argue that, the small kind of laboratory that you're describing in 2010 or 15, like now it's a world laboratory. Like everyone knows Bitcoin and most people know Ethereum, not how it works, but they've heard the name, right? Which is not something you could say in 2013. So there's definitely this awareness. There's so many experiments. So we can touch on that later. But so going back to your background, what led to the creation then of Regen Network? So you saw Bitcoin, you saw Ethereum. Well, what was the trigger where you're like, okay, I see what's going on, and there's an experiment that I want to try? I don't know if we can call it an experiment. It's more than that. But.
Yeah, two things happened. One is I had a son, I had a child, and I took a paternity leave. And so I like took space out of my life, and in a classic millennial kind of, I guess, moment. In order to afford to have paternity leave, I ran a GoFundMe campaign, and like the community supported me to have a couple months off to just sort of like be with my family. During those couple months, I just had a lot of time to be thinking and reflecting and, asking myself, what's the change that the world is asking for?
What year was that, if I may ask, or around what year?
2017.
2017.
So spring of 2017, I had all this time off, and that just happens to coincide with the beginning of the ICO boom on Ethereum. And so there I am looking at my Coinbase account, and the shift of the value from 2015 to 2017. And that was the first time.
Yeah, you went from GoFundMe to AllFundMe.
Kind of. Yeah, I mean, that took a little bit longer to mature, but it shifted. My financial reality was shifting. The fact that all of these people were coming in, and it wasn't really the shift of financial capital in my life, but more so just I had this sense that the zeitgeist was shifting, that the Overton window was opening, that there was now this opportunity societally to actually lean into these questions. Before 2017, the number of people who are willing to kind of question, whether I agree with them or not, question and take a crack at reinventing money, right? And
Yeah.
be like, what would money be if it was reflective of values, societal values that anchor us in one way of being or another way of being? In my case, I am passionate about reinventing money so that it anchors us into a set of regenerative values and a regenerative and a right relationship with the biosphere and the ecosystems we live in. That's what I'm excited about. But I'm also excited when people are excited about other, things, because money is so deeply, so profoundly part of how we coordinate at scale a society, right? Without, like, money is like the meta social contract, right? And so
Do you think it's I mean, we'll touch a bit more on that after, but do you think it's the same when it comes to Web3? Do you think that the model in Web2 of like money is, I mean, I put this in quotes, everything, let's keep making money. Do you think it's the same model in Web3? Or do you think that there's more opportunities, there's more experiments that are being done where it hasn't been kind of corrupted by centralized entities yet? So of course people are looking for money, but they're also looking for interesting experiments. Like, what would be your take on Web2 versus Web3 when it comes to the kind of financial models and regenerative practices? Okay, now I'm stepping forward in the second part. I didn't want to go too far on that, but like just to have a brief take on this point.
No, if I had to critique Web3 for one thing, I think it's like even on overdrive in terms of its focus on financial capital specifically and money as an instrument for putting a price on everything. But there are glimmers. It's sort of like that's the overall whole, but there are glimmers that are different, and we can get into those sort of like countercurrents and interesting experiments. But when I talk about money, maybe it'd be better if we use the term currency because it's less loaded. And I really am talking about, if we thought of Ethereum, ETH as a currency, ETH is many things, right? But one of the things it is a medium of exchange, potentially a store of value for many people. Unit of account, it represents gas, it represents a number of goods and services that you can procure out.
Being a credential soon in the future, just because you own ETH, you have a credential.
It starts to become this whole sort of multivalent system. And its value is derived from a very different place than, say, the value of a US dollar, right? So network money is different from state money. Digitally native money is different from money that evolved in an era of sort of like analog agreement. So when I'm talking about money, I'm really going deeper into my understanding that, essentially money or currency is, as I said, like a meta social contract. We're all agreeing that something has value together. If this premise is true, that all forms of currency are really just the reflection of a social contract that we're agreeing, everybody is getting together and we're just agreeing that something has value. That includes gold. It includes
Dogecoin. You even say Dogecoin.
And that's the beauty of Web3 is Dogecoin. The beauty of Web3 is like the joke that the meme coin that
becomes a reality.
It becomes a reality, and it illustrates so clearly that all that's happening is people are getting together and they're deciding that something has value together. And if we made that process conscious, right? If we made that process of what am I imbuing with value with my time and attention, what do I choose to receive from my time and attention? I have this idea that actually humans, societies of humans, collectives of humans, being able to choose the symbolic representation of value, which is money, is a basic human right. That actually that is a fundamental human right that's been forgotten or intentionally left out of, like, the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the human right, like the Bill of Rights in the United States. But the ability for people to be consciously in groups making a choice about what money they're using, I actually think is a fundamental human right.
And I think the hard question or debate comes when you talk about consciousness, because if you take the example of social consensus, there's usually, I don't know if it's the right term, a leader or someone that is guiding the social movement, right? For example, Dogecoin would be not only, but Elon Musk, right? If you took Bretton Woods and gold, you could argue that it's the US. So there's always someone leading this movement. So do you see the social consensus?
People always have interest. This is totally, you're pointing out, like, almost inevitably behind when we get into money and politics, even non-money things, people have interests, and people sometimes do things that are bad for others that are good for them to defend their specific interests. That is a really challenging scenario. And I think that's another interesting layer of the development of Web3, in which we have a transparent computational contract. Like, we have a protocol, right? And the rules of that protocol can be read and audited by all people who opt into participating in it, and including the rules of how that protocol is upgraded or not upgraded. So the potential is to have these, like, computational constitutions and these computational law systems and these computational economic systems that potentially are transparent and auditable, where those interests are just transparent. Not that they don't exist, but that they're transparent. And furthermore, that we can, to some degree, create processes and checks and balances, just like in the United States, we have checks and balances. There was this novel innovation of this Constitution that had a separation of power between the judicial branch, the executive branch, and the legislative branch. And it created checks and balances, and it created, for all of its problems, it created a sort of a framework that created all this space for people to move and be creative and do things. I think there's like a next generation of that's possible when we actually think of the compute networks, like blockchains, as a social computing system. And that's another really different way that I perceive things than, like, a Bitcoin maxi, for instance, because I perceive any blockchain network as a social computing system that embedded in it has a set of social contracts that we're opting into and we're choosing to imbue value with. That's the basic fabric. And out of that derives the moneyness or the value. It derives sort of like trustlessness, or that is to say, the minimization of the trust that you need between counterparties to do different things, which, just by the way, is the same thing that the Constitution did in the United States, right? It lowered the amount of one-to-one trust that was needed in society because people had trust in a bigger system to hold contracts, or to be like, go down to the notary, or like, oh, I trust that this could get litigated and therefore I don't have to behave in the same way.
On this point, something interesting is you're mentioning the Constitution, the judicial branch, legislative. I think it's the ability of Web3 to pivot much faster through this social consensus, because we're moving so fast that if you look at the Constitution, you have people in the US on the streets, literally, if you're going to amend anything. And so when it comes to Web3, I want to know how your take on this is it an advantage or a disadvantage that we have this ability to pivot so fast, which means that experiments can happen on a weekly basis. So that can be a good thing, but also it prevents good or positive technology to really be in front of everyone or in front of retail, because there's always a new thing.
It's both a good and bad thing. I mean, I think this concept of immutability, so like the Bitcoin maxis would say that what's important is the immutability and the depoliticization. Like it's like no longer a political thing. It's a fixed supply. It runs in this following way. There's no way of changing it. There's no upgrading it. And that can be powerful, right? Because it creates like stability. On the other hand, you have people who, maybe there's this whole spectrum. On the other hand, you have people who spin up completely new networks or spin up new smart contracts on Ethereum. Right? Ethereum is like the other side of, in some ways, the experimentation spectrum. Michael Zargum, who's the founder of Block Science and who's been deeply influential in the Web3 space, says something like, we should throw out the term of immutability and we should be asking about the spectrum of durability that's needed to generate the right level of trust, right? But the right level of evolutionary capability. And so you want something that can evolve and change, but only at the speed that allows the sort of like the coordination of the community to like keep up. Because anytime you change something, you break a set of other agreements, right, between people that they've been relying on. But those agreements may not be reflective of reality in different ways. And so there's this tuning of durability, of the durability of agreements, where you want it to evolve at a particular pace so that the community can keep up with a rapidly changing world. But you want it to be, you want enough restraint and you want enough durability and sort of like conservatism so that it doesn't just completely explode the community that's forming around it, because different interests, people have sort of different ideas. And that's and in different situations and different applications, you'll have different dynamics. And this is why this specific fact is why I'm a Cosmos maxi instead of an Ethereum maxi.
Interesting.
Because Cosmos, as its core thesis, allows any group of people to generate network consensus around any set of rules and basically like create the right hardness of changing or easiness of changing. And so like in different applications for different communities, the durability is going to be different. It's going to need to be different for different people. And then you can interoperate. So it's like that. This is a social computer. Different groups have different social contracts and need to reflect those in different ways. We need pluralism, not a monolithic system. And that sort of like really speaks to my perspective about sort of like the optimal application of Web3 for the evolution of our social coordination system.
So yeah, before we close this loop and go to back or start with the Regen Network, actually, you mentioned that you were kind of a Cosmos maxi. I want to have your take on, we had Jim Chang recently, and he believes in a modular future where you have millions of blockchains. Is that the future that you kind of envisioned for Web3 that you would like, where there's like millions of blockchains, app chains everywhere, that even Uniswap could be this way? Or
yeah. The only future for Uniswap is as an app chain with multiple deployments. Like, the only way to efficiently coordinate in a multi-chain or interchain world is that you have sort of like this core governance core that through interchain messaging and, you know, the ability for nested, so like blockchains can own pieces of one another, just like companies can. You know, you can create consortiums and alliances just like countries and companies do. It's so much more flexible and representative than sort of like the monolithic approach, this sort of like modular, composable approach. And what's really clear to me is that IBC, Inter-Blockchain Communication Protocol, is going to be where network effect takes place. I mean, I think a lot of people in the Ethereum world think like, oh, Ethereum is going to be where the network effect takes place. But that doesn't really make sense when you have a permissionless peer-to-peer blockchain communication protocol that doesn't tax you for using it, right? That's where everybody is going to entrain to, right? And it'll evolve and it'll be open.
We need to build the infrastructure, build the liquidity, but that's where you see us going, basically.
I think, I mean, just as the Ethereum community is becoming more and more like Cosmos. Like there's app rollups and there's all of this stuff. There's like obsession with the layer 2 ecosystem, and many of the layer 2 ecosystem isn't even layer 2. It's actually like just a completely different blockchain, like Polygon. It's like, it's not a layer 2 at all. It's just a layer 1 that runs the Ethereum virtual machine and has some bridges, right? So, you know, we already live in this sort of like internet of blockchains. That's already happened. So that prediction that the Cosmos community was making has already come true. And now the question is, how do you lower friction of interoperability? How do you make for safe bridging? And that's the new thing. Like everybody's working on that all of the time. And the bulk of the work, really, I believe, like the bulk of the good work is, really getting sucked into innovations around interblockchain communication protocol and allowing IBC to sort of be this sort of like settlement layer that isn't trying to tax people for using it, right? It's not trying to route everybody through a specific chain that then pumps their value up. It's just it's purely a public good, right? And it's kind of the only one that did that. It's really the only community that said, our core thesis, we're gonna put it out there as a pure public good, right? And that's why Ethereum's going to be Ethereum's going to be durable. It's going to be a place for experimentation. It's going to be an amazing community. Like Ethereum is core to all of this, but it won't be the thing. It's going to be a major part of a much broader pluralistic community and network of blockchains. Because if you think about it, like spinning up a municipal voting system, to do that, I'm going to want to use the Cosmos SDK. I'm not going to want to use a smart contract on Ethereum, because as a community, I'm going to want to be able to set all the parameters and use my own computers and be able to audit and check things. And the more that you rely on this big abstract thing, the less that you have localism, the less that you have local empowerment, the less that you can program your own values and rule sets into what's happening. And there's always this tension between like the empire, the monolithic big thing. And I know the Ethereum community isn't going to want to be
associated with the empire,
but that's what it is.
Sure.
And there's good things and there's bad things about that. But you have this monolithic single set of rules that sort of like governs everything in the way that the economics work and the way that the governance works and the way that the security works. And, and a lot of people just are going to have slightly different needs or vastly different needs and want to express those different needs, but still want to communicate with each other and still want to like trade, exchange, engagement. And so this sort of like Cosmos allows you to have that full spectrum of flexibility.
And so going back to the Regen Network, because I realized that we haven't really defined what is the Regen Network. So could you give an overview of really what is the mission of Regen Network based on, of course, the whole vision that you've been discussing?
Yeah, so I'll answer it two different ways. So like the founding vision and I'd say the long game for Regen Network and like what we're always sort of like moving towards is to connect money and value directly to ecological regeneration, so that ecological regeneration is appropriately understood in our society for what it is, which is the source of 100% of value, wealth, and societal sustainability. Like nothing exists without a healthy biosphere. Nothing does. Our computers don't, our food doesn't, nothing exists without the healthy biosphere. So our thesis is, our store of value, our units of account, our meat of exchange needs to be rooted in and reflect ecological health and regeneration in a direct relationship. And we can get into sort of the way that the 8 forms of capital and that framework influence this perspective. So that's the big mission. The go-to-market strategy to make that happen in a practical, tangible way, to build community, to build tools, to build a vibrant market, and to build the foundation, like the primitives of that new system, sort of new monetary, new financial system, regenerative financial system, is Regen has created a registry system for eco credits. That is to say, units that represent ecological value. And the most common of those that has an existing market where we have success in sort of producing and selling these credits, these that represent ecological value, is carbon markets, where there's demand for carbon credits. There's also emerging demand for biodiversity credits. There's emerging demand for water credits and other units. So having a flow of kind of these ecological commodities, if you will, or ecological collectibles where there's a symbolic representation of value that's usually a public good or a common pool resource. So there's a lot of innovation. It's not a private good in the way that it's different from other markets, but there's like a flow, there's a production flow, people produce it, other people sell it. That exchange is the foundation for then building sort of like new financial instruments and new monetary instruments. Those new financial and monetary instruments have to be rooted in the first sort of stage of things, where this sort of like ecological debiting and ecological crediting is taking place in a transparent, responsible way. So Regen Network at the moment, basically all of our functionality is built on, governing standards, producing transparent credits, and allowing community governance around specific eco-crediting protocols so that they can match market demand with real on-the-ground need and make sort of as frictionless as possible the exchange based on that ecological value.
So what would be the major milestones when it comes to Regen Network? Because you mentioned the registry, you have the marketplace. Do you have any use cases or partners that you would like to highlight in terms of so someone that might not necessarily know Regen Network, what would be the best way for him to understand more, of course, going on the website and everything that you mentioned, but do you have a use case in mind or a recent example of potentially a partner?
Sure. We have 6 different new forms of eco credits coming into the marketplace over the next 6 months or so. So one really exciting one is Roots, which is an Argentinian holistic management project developer, and they have been regenerating soil in Patagonia through holistic management of the grazing systems there to sort of regenerate the pampas and build deep soil. There's also amazing work being done by Kulshan Carbon Trust, which is doing wildfire risk mitigation, and that's a fancy way of saying they're out in the Pacific Northwest where there's a huge amount of fire danger every year and increasing. And they're using these mobile biochar kilns to sort of thin forests, make them healthier, and turn that into biochar and redistribute it so that it simulates burning. And those forests evolved to burn, right? But it does so in a way that captures most of the carbon and allows it to become like richer, deeper soil through biochar. So in both cases, these are carbon removal credits where you can scientifically prove through multiple sources that more carbon is being sequestered into the system than is being emitted. So those are 2 examples of sort of credits that are coming into our market where there's demand for those credits, and we're sort of facilitating an exchange. Right now, we have Regen Marketplace, which allows people to buy and sell and retire these eco credits. And as you said, we have Regen Registry, which is really a sort of modular approach for people to publish this sort of self-governed standards around crediting in a clear process where you can sort of where we have quite a bit of restraint around forcing projects to sort of clearly express how they're answering the questions that lead to the market's ability to assess quality. So it's sort of a hybrid of science and governance, where you're sort of applying science to say, hey, this is, for instance, how we're measuring soil carbon, or hey, this is how we're measuring biodiversity, and here's who has peer-reviewed this data or this methodology, so that a buyer can sort of see all of that packaged and then refer to external standards to see if they match their needs.
So on this point, what are the major hurdles that you're encountering with Regen Network? Is it education? Is it the trust issue? What difficulties, if any, are you encountering?
No, there's definitely a set of difficulties. I mean, I think the bulk of the market for these sorts of assets comes from the corporate world, and the corporate world is not necessarily comfortable with Web3. And so it'd be much easier for the corporate world from like a go-to-market strategy if we were just a Web2 company and we were just sort of like doing things the way that they expect them to be done. Of course, that doesn't create a transparent public infrastructure that is transformative.
Sorry to interrupt. I just had this very novice question, but I'm sure a lot of people would have it's a bit stupid, but still, I'm curious to ask it. Obviously, there's greenwashing that is present in society. Would it be possible to do greenwashing in a Web3? Because technically speaking, when we look at blockchain, it should not be possible. But do you think there would be ways for companies to abuse the system or say we're doing carbon credits, we're doing good things, but in fact, we're actually doing greenwashing, or it would be a new term in Web3? But do you see that possibility down the line or not?
I guess it sort of depends on how much wisdom we have in the system. Because just having the, in quotes, the facts in front of you in kind of complex. So it's like, how much are people's interests distorting reality? Like you can have all the facts in front of you and still make the wrong sort of decision or make the wrong assumption. So Web3 doesn't magically fix the real core of reality.
You believe and trust in what is shown to you, right?
Totally. And so there's sort of like, you need a culture, not just the technology. Like the complement to a technology that allows for this like radical transparency and searchability and durability of like who said what about where using what data and what methodology, you know, you also need the right culture and the right incentives so that there isn't a reality distortion field around those facts, right? It isn't purely the representation of facts that, you know, leads to, I guess, like a transparent, rational, well-functioning market.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I guess we'll have the answers in a couple of years, right? We can't guess with our crystal balls, but we should down the line have these answers. As we approach the end of the episode, Gregory, I would like to know, like, what are your kind of guilty pleasures in Web3? Like, are you like 100% of the time fully focused on Regen Network because obviously you're passionate about the subject, but do you have time to do other things, or what are your generally guilty pleasures in Web3?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm pretty focused on Regen Network. I do participate in a little bit of NFT stuff, both as a creator and also, you know, as a collector. You know, specifically, I really like the Stargaze market and network, and that's a Cosmos community owned. So like the community actually owns the blockchain that secures the NFTs. And so there's really nice tight loop. It's sort of like as if OpenSea was fully a community cooperative for artists. And so like the marketplace and all of the different features and all of the different things and collections, and it's all sort of like integrated. And I think that that's a really fun experiment. And so sometimes in my free time, I go and, you know, like hang out and play and curate my collections and, you know, participate in governance over there. Other than that, I'm mostly just focused. And Regen has a relationship with Stargaze. Like we've been offsetting their protocol, and so I think there'll be collections and other stuff. So there's also an element of like, oh, there's a alliance or connection, and that's true for many other projects as well, where we're trying to build bridges or relationships. But Stargaze is the one where I would probably be doing it whether or not, you know, we had a sort of like in quotes business relationship. I'd probably be playing around on Stargaze.
Awesome. Do you have any final thoughts or project person that inspired you lately? Someone that you want to shout out specifically before we close out the episode?
I'm just trying to think of who maybe isn't getting shouted out, that it's worth daylighting. I've really been the work that Deepa and her crew has been doing around impact DAOs and like creating sort of this ethnography of all of the people who are building these sort of digitally native communities to achieve impact in the world, and learnings and mistakes and, you know, successes, and just sort of highlighting that, I think is really cool. So I'll shout out to Deepa because the impact DAO work and the sort of the publishing that they're doing is really...
Is it called the Impact DAO or
Impact DAO? Impact DAOs, I think, is the thing. So it's not Impact DAO. She and her team are like publishing work about different projects like Regen Network and others, and it's really rich. Like, you know, Collectivo, I mean, Collectivo is doing amazing work. They always deserve a shout out. They're doing super cool things. But Impact DAO has published work about Collectivo, about Regen, about Gitcoin, about like this whole community of people who are working towards towards creating
a regenerative future, we could say. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Gregory, for being part of this episode. Links for Regen Network and Gregory will obviously be in the description. As for us, on Twitter, NEWFORUM_NCO. And thank you so much to everyone watching and for the amazing work that Gregory and Regen Network are doing. So thank you again, Gregory.
Lots of fun, Jordan. Thank you.